Whispers in the Rain. It was a cold, unforgiving night when Sarah found herself stranded on the desolate road. The storm had caught her off guard. The rain beat down relentlessly, the sky filled with ominous swirling clouds. The wipers of her car fought valiantly against the torrent, but it was no use. The road ahead was a blur, and visibility was near zero. She pulled over, heart pounding. The engine's hum the only sound in the oppressive silence. The radio crackled, sending out random bursts of static but nothing more. There was no phone signal, no sign of any other vehicle. Just her, alone in the dark, with the rain hammering against her windows. A figure emerged from the rain, drenched and stumbling toward her car. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was a man, soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his frame. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a hat, but his eyes glowed with an eerie light, reflecting the fleeting flash of the storm's lightning. Her heart raced as he knocked on her window. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. Against every instinct that screamed for her to drive away, Sarah rolled down the window, a crack enough to hear him better. "I need shelter," he repeated, his voice urgent. "I was walking, and something's wrong." The air around him felt heavy, thick with an energy Sarah couldn't place. She hesitated, staring at him, before glancing around. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour, and the road was now completely empty. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky. His eyes flashed, and in that moment, the temperature seemed to drop. "Please," he whispered, his breath fogging up her window. "I need to get out of here. I heard them. They're coming." Sarah's pulse quickened, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she couldn't move. She just stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away from the unnatural glow in his gaze. And then she heard it. A faint sound, a whisper carried by the wind, rising in pitch as it grew closer. "Help me," the whisper echoed. The man's head turned slightly toward the sound, and for the first time, Sarah saw his lips twist into a grin, wide, unnatural, and full of malice. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice low and unsettling. "They're already here." Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. There were multiple voices now, all around her car, scratching against the windows, tapping on the roof. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her entire body frozen in place. The wipers stopped moving. The car lights flickered. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, and the whispers, voices that she couldn't place, began to chant, as though reciting some ancient forbidden incantation. The man stepped closer to the window, his grin widening. "It's too late now. You should have driven away." And then, with a sudden jolt, the man was gone. In the blink of an eye, the storm vanished. The rain ceased, leaving behind only an unnatural silence. The air around her was still, suffocating, as if everything had stopped for a brief moment in time. Sarah looked around, her heart hammering in her chest, but the road was empty. No figure, no whispers, only the echo of her own breath in the stillness. She started the car, the engine rumbling to life, and sped off down the road, not daring to look back. As she drove, the whispers followed, growing louder, closer. Help me, help me, help me. And in the distance, through the dark, a shadow began to take form, its glowing eyes watching her every move. The rain was no longer the storm she had feared. It was something far worse. As Sarah drove faster, the sound of the whispers seemed to draw closer, like a haunting melody creeping through the cracks of her sanity. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. But no matter how fast she pressed the gas pedal, the whispers followed, an omnipresent sound that twisted her thoughts. The road, now eerily calm, stretched endlessly ahead, but the feeling of being chased grew unbearable. She looked in the rearview mirror, nothing but darkness. The road behind her was clear, yet the whispers, low and guttural, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, were closer than ever. "Make it stop," she whispered to herself, trying to drown out the noise by clenching her teeth, focusing only on the road. But the voices in her head, louder than before, seemed to have multiplied. They were no longer just whispers. They were commands, demanding something from her. "Stop the car," one voice ordered. "No, I can't stop," Sarah shouted aloud, her voice trembling with terror. But the car seemed to be moving of its own accord, slowing down, as though some invisible force had gripped the wheel. Her heart hammered in her chest as the road ahead narrowed, leading her toward a twisted, fog-covered path that she didn't recognize. She tried to steer away, but her hands were no longer in control. The whispers grew more frantic, swirling around her as the fog thickened, blocking out everything except the faint glow of her headlights. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the mist, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the road. It was the man, the same one from before. "Get out of the car," the figure commanded, his voice now echoing in Sarah's mind. Invasive and commanding. Panic surged through her veins, and she slammed her foot on the brake. The car screeched to a halt, but Sarah didn't wait for it to stop completely. She yanked the door open and bolted into the mist, her heart pounding in her chest. The cold rain hit her skin like needles, but she ran, her shoes slipping on the wet ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were all around her now, crawling into her ears, wrapping around her mind. She couldn't think. She couldn't escape. "Help me! Help me!" She looked back. The man was there, following her, his glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. "No!" Sarah screamed. "Stay away!" But the man's grin only widened, and in the distance, the figure of another person appeared, a woman, drenched and staring directly at Sarah. "Run," the woman whispered, her voice carried by the wind. "You have to run." "Who are you?" Sarah gasped, but the woman didn't answer. She just kept staring, her eyes pleading, as if urging Sarah to understand something she couldn't yet see. Without warning, the mist parted, revealing a house standing alone at the edge of the road. It was an old, decrepit building, its windows broken and its door hanging off its hinges. The whispers grew louder, now joined by a chorus of agonized wails. Sarah's legs moved on their own as if the house was pulling her toward it. She didn't want to go inside. She knew she shouldn't, but her body betrayed her, dragging her forward like a puppet on a string. She reached the doorstep and hesitated. The whispers in the rain grew deafening now, clamoring for her attention. filling her ears with an unholy mix of voices. She turned the door handle, and it creaked open, as though expecting her. The inside was pitch black, save for the dim glow of candles scattered around the room. The air was thick with the scent of decay. As Sarah stepped in, she was greeted by an overwhelming sense of despair. The feeling that something was terribly wrong. There in the center of the room was an altar. On it, blood-stained and covered with symbols she couldn't recognize, lay a book that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers intensified, and suddenly everything clicked into place. This was no ordinary house. This was the source. She turned, desperate to run, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the suffocating darkness. The man's voice echoed through the room. "You're not leaving. Not now." Sarah backed away, her heart hammering, her breaths shallow. The shadows in the room began to writhe, shifting like living things. Figures, dark and indistinct, moved within the walls, watching her. "You have to do it," the woman's voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't outside her mind. It was inside, like a voice coming from the very core of her being. "Do what?" Sarah begged, trembling. The woman appeared again, stepping out of the shadows, her face pale and hollow. "You have to destroy the book." Sarah's eyes went wide. "Destroy it? How?" The woman's eyes darkened with fear. "It holds the souls of the lost, the ones who never escaped. If you don't, they will never let you leave." A cold chill crawled down Sarah's spine. The room was suffocating now, the darkness closing in around her. She reached towards the book, her hands shaking, knowing that whatever happened next, it would either be her salvation or her doom. But as her fingers brushed the cover, the whispers intensified to a deafening roar, and the walls of the room began to crack. The figures within the walls reached out, their hands clawing toward her, their voices growing frenzied. Sarah could feel them, their pain, their longing, their anger. She grabbed the book, her breath ragged, and with every ounce of strength, she hurled it into the altar's flames. As it burned, the figures screamed, their voices echoing into the heavens. For a moment, everything was still. The storm outside stopped. The rain ceased. The darkness began to lift. But as Sarah turned to leave, a cold, familiar hand touched her shoulder. She froze. "Did you really think you could leave?" the man whispered behind her, his breath cold against her neck. The house shook violently, and the whispers began anew, louder than ever. It wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere, deep within the storm, the souls of the lost were still waiting for their chance to claim her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, as the man's cold hand gripped her shoulder. She spun around, her eyes locking with his glowing ones. His grin had twisted into something far more sinister now, full of malice and hunger. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, his voice scraping against her soul. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with life, closing in on her from all directions. She could hear the faint echoes of the whispers, now a cacophony of tortured souls, swirling like a storm within her mind. With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah wrenched herself free from his grip and stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how much longer she could stand it. how much longer the oppressive darkness would consume her. The woman's words echoed in her mind. If you don't destroy the book, they will never let you leave. But Sarah had already burned the book. The flames had consumed it, turning it to ash. Yet the presence in the house only seemed to grow stronger. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, hunting her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The walls trembled. The ground beneath her feet groaned, as if the very foundation of the house was pulling itself apart. Desperate, Sarah ran towards the back door, but it was locked, barricaded from the outside. There was no escape, no way out. Panic surged in her chest as she pounded against the door. "Help! Someone, please!" Her voice cracked, barely audible over the deafening whispers, but no one answered. The man moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "You think you can run? You can't escape what's already inside you?" His words felt like a curse, a promise of torment that would follow her forever. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, seeking anything that could help her. The room was full of relics, old furniture, broken mirrors, and faded paintings. But nothing seemed useful. Nothing could save her from what was coming. Suddenly, the room flickered. For a split second, the darkness lifted, and Sarah saw something she hadn't noticed before. In the far corner of the room, partially obscured by a broken chair, was a narrow stairway leading down into an even darker abyss below. It was the only way out. It was the only chance. Without hesitation, Sarah bolted toward the stairs, her legs shaky beneath her. The whispers followed her, relentless, gnawing at her mind. She descended into the darkness, the temperature dropping with each step. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around her. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded photographs of faces she didn't recognize. Families, children, and strangers who seemed frozen in time. Their eyes followed her as she moved, a sickening sense of déjà vu creeping over her. She turned the corner and gasped. At the end of the hallway, in a dimly lit room, stood a mirror, a full-length mirror framed in dark, twisted wood. But it wasn't just any mirror. It was ancient, its surface warped and cracked, as though it had been here for centuries. And in that mirror, Sarah saw something she couldn't explain. The reflection showed her standing in the room, but beside her was the man, the same glowing-eyed figure, his hand reaching out to touch her. Number. This couldn't be happening. She was alone in this room. She knew she was. But the mirror was showing something else. It was showing her fate. With a scream, Sarah turned away from the mirror, but the whispers intensified. They seemed to echo from every corner of the room now, filling the space with voices, with cries of agony, of despair. "You can't leave," they whispered. "You belong to us now." She stumbled backward, her heart racing in terror. But the walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath her feet shaking violently. In the reflection, the man's grin grew wider, impossibly wide, until his face was a mask of pure malice. "You'll never escape," he sneered. "You're already ours." Desperate, Sarah scrambled to her feet and ran, her hands brushing against the walls, her mind spinning. The house felt like it was shifting around her, its very structure bending, distorting, as though it were alive and angry. With no clear destination in mind, Sarah ran, hoping for some kind of salvation, some way to break free from this nightmare. And then, just as the darkness began to swallow her whole, she heard it. A soft, distant sound. Footsteps. They were growing closer, faint at first but unmistakable. Someone else was in the house. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she wasn't alone, after all. Maybe there was someone who could help her. But when she turned the corner, she froze in place. The footsteps weren't just approaching her, they were circling her. A voice whispered in her ear, soft but unmistakable. "You should have never come back." She whipped around, but there was no one there. The figure of the man appeared in front of her, his eyes glowing brighter than ever before. The house seemed to pulse with energy as he reached for her, his hand cold and unyielding. "This is where you will stay," he said, "forever." The walls of the house surged with an otherworldly force, the whispers of the lost souls merging into one deafening roar. And Sarah realized, with a sickening certainty, that she had become one of them. Another lost soul trapped in the endless cycle, doomed to haunt the house and its corridors forever. As the man's grip tightened around her wrist, she felt the last of her strength drain away. The house swallowed her whole. The storm outside raged on. Sarah's vision blurred, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she felt the crushing weight of hopelessness. The man's grip on her wrist was like ice, cold and unyielding, dragging her deeper into the house. Every part of her screamed for escape, but her legs refused to move. The whispers, now an overwhelming roar, filled her mind with torment, drowning out her thoughts. "Let me go," Sarah gasped, her voice weak and trembling. But the man didn't respond. His grin widened as his fingers tightened around her wrist, pulling her toward the shadowy depths of the house. In that instant she understood. This was no ordinary place. This house was alive, a twisted maze of despair that fed on the souls of the lost. And she was its latest victim. She could feel it. It knew her now, recognized her as one of its own. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. And the very floor beneath her feet seemed to shift with each step, like she was walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare that refused to end. She struggled, her heart pounding, desperate to break free. "Please," she whispered, "I don't want to stay here. Please." The man's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. "You can't leave," he said softly, his voice barely more than a hiss. "You're already a part of it now. There's no going back." Sarah's body went cold as she realized the truth. Her fight, her desperation to escape, it was all futile. She was trapped, just like the others, bound to the cursed house, doomed to become another whisper in the rain. But then, something strange happened. As the man's grip tightened, Sarah felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of energy within her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resignation. It was a primal, fierce determination. Something deep inside that refused to give up. She wasn't going to let this be her end. Without thinking, Sarah yanked her arm free, breaking the man's hold. The shock of it rattled her, but she didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the hallway, faster than she thought possible. Her mind screamed at her to keep moving, to not stop, no matter what. The house seemed to groan with fury as she sprinted through the corridors, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, but she didn't dare look back. The walls around her felt as though they were closing in, but there was no time to worry about that now. Ahead of her, the narrow stairwell loomed, a way out, a glimmer of hope in the ever-tightening darkness. But just as she reached it, the shadows shifted, and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. She spun around, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and there, at the far end of the hallway, stood the figure of the man once again. His eyes were glowing even brighter now, his grin more twisted than ever before. But this time, something was different. The house itself seemed to tremble around him, as if it were responding to his presence. "No more running," he said, his voice filled with finality. "It's time for you to join us." The ground beneath Sarah's feet cracked, and the floor split open with a violent shudder, revealing a dark pit, a chasm that seemed to stretch infinitely into the void. From within, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if calling to her, pulling her towards the depths. For a split second, fear gripped Sarah's heart. This was it. The end. She was going to fall into that abyss, lost forever in the dark. But then, the woman's voice whispered again, faint but clear. "Destroy him before it's too late." Sarah's eyes snapped to the figure in front of her. The man, no, the thing, was moving toward her, his form distorting with every step. He wasn't human. He was something older, something darker, something born from the shadows of the house itself. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Sarah glanced around, searching for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on the broken mirror at the far end of the hallway. The reflection, distorted, twisted, showed her the truth. The house was feeding off the man, just as it had fed off the others before her. She understood now. To break free, she had to destroy him. He was the heart of this nightmare, the key to the house's dark power. With the trembling hands, she grabbed a shard of glass from the broken mirror. The sharp edges bit into her fingers, but she didn't care. The whispers grew louder as she stepped toward him, but she didn't waver. The man's smile faltered for just a moment, and Sarah seized the opportunity. She lunged forward, the shard of glass aimed directly at his chest. "No!" he screamed, his voice distorting, as if he were being torn apart. But it was too late. The glass pierced his heart, and with a sickening crack, his form shattered like glass, his body crumbling into dust. The house trembled violently as if it were dying, its grip loosening on her. The whispers stopped. The air, once thick with dread, cleared. The walls of the house began to crumble, the floors beneath her feet no longer shifting with malicious intent. For the first time since she had entered the house, the oppressive weight lifted. The storm outside began to fade, the rain turning into a gentle drizzle. Sarah stood in the middle of the crumbling house, the shattered remnants of the mirror scattered at her feet. Her breath was ragged, her body bruised and broken, but she was alive. She turned towards the door, which now stood ajar, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The world beyond was quiet, peaceful, free of the torment she had just escaped. With one final glance back, Sarah stepped out of the house, her footsteps fading into the distance, leaving the nightmare behind. The storm had passed. As Sarah stepped into the pale light of dawn, the silence outside felt almost unnatural after the chaos she had just endured. The rain had stopped, leaving only a few droplets clinging to the leaves and grass, glistening like tiny fragile gems. The sky was clearing, revealing soft pastel hues that promised a new day. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Her breath was shaky, each inhale a reminder of the terror she had just barely escaped. Her skin was cold, her body bruised and exhausted from the horror she'd endured. But despite everything, she felt a strange sense of peace. The weight that had clung to her, the suffocating presence of the house, had vanished. For a moment she stood frozen in place, trying to gather her bearings. The house behind her, no longer a towering oppressive structure, was now little more than a decaying ruin, barely standing, its windows shattered and its walls crumbling. It seemed as though the house itself had collapsed under the weight of its own darkness. But even as the house disintegrated, Sarah could feel a lingering presence, a sensation deep within her chest, like a dark seed taking root. It wasn't over. She had destroyed the man, but there was something more, something she hadn't accounted for. A rustling sound came from behind her, faint but distinct, pulling her attention away from the wreckage of the house. She turned slowly, her heart pounding once again, her senses on high alert. The whispers had stopped, but that silence, there was something unnerving about it, something wrong. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the mist that still clung to the earth like a living thing. It was a woman, but not the one she had encountered in the house. This one had an ethereal quality, her form shimmering, her eyes empty voids that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. The woman's lips parted, her voice barely audible over the soft breeze, but the words were unmistakable. "You think you've escaped," she said, her tone soft, cold and distant. "But the house doesn't release its hold so easily." Sarah's pulse quickened as a sense of dread began to creep over her again. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The woman took a slow step forward, her form flickering in and out of focus, like a shadow caught between two worlds. "You've broken its physical shell," she whispered, "but the house, the curse, it lives in your mind now. It will never let you go." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. She had destroyed the book, defeated the man, and freed herself from the nightmare. She couldn't be losing her mind to this place again. "You're lying," Sarah spat, trying to steady her breath, trying to convince herself that she was still in control. "I'm free." The woman's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "The house doesn't let go. It is the embodiment of all the lost souls, the broken, the tormented. You think you've broken it, but now it's inside you. Forever." The woman stepped closer, her voice now a sharp whisper that cut through Sarah's resolve like a blade. "You'll never escape." Suddenly, the ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to tremble. Her vision blurred, and for the briefest moment, she could feel the walls of the house pressing against her once again, the cold, suffocating darkness creeping into her mind. The whispers, the voices, began to echo faintly in the back of her skull, distant but growing louder, clawing at her sanity. "No," Sarah shouted. shaking her head, willing the visions away. She took a step back, but the world around her felt like it was closing in. The mist swirling with images of the house, the rooms, the hallway, the altar, each corner haunting her mind. The woman's voice, now barely a hiss, crawled under her skin. You can't fight it. You can't outrun it. It's already a part of you. Sarah clutched her head, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. Her mind was a battlefield, warring between the darkness that threatened to consume her and the flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, she could escape it once and for all. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned and ran, her feet slipping in the wet grass. But as she sprinted, the world around her began to shift, the landscape distorting like a nightmare in motion. The trees twisted, the ground cracked open, and the house loomed ahead of her, impossibly large and foreboding. No, no!